Well, hello everybody out there in YouTube land, and thanks once more for tuning in to Classic Dirt Bike TV. Now, I've been reading my video archives once again, and in this next video we'll be taking a look at Donny Bruces JBR 500 Honda. Now, we'll also be having a look at Andy Malloch's 414 Montesa Cappra, which is an almost original bike from back in the day. Now, we'll also have a look at a quite nice 1976 KX250 Kawasaki that I spotted at the Telford Show in 2020. Now, we'll also be looking at an old battered 510 TC Husqvarna four-stroker, and then we'll maybe finish the video off with a look at a CR250 Red Rocket. So it's all happening in this next featured clip. So enough talking from me for the moment. Let's just get straight into our first machine. Okay, first up, this is Donny Bruces JBR 500 Honda. Now, the story goes that originally these JBRs, or John Banks replica motorcycles, were fitted with BSA motors when they were first introduced in the 1970s, and that was when the legendary motocross rider Big John Banks was left unemployed when BSA shut down its competition department in the early 1970s. Now, John Banks then signed to ride a Shenny BSA for the 1973 season, and he won the British Championship on that bike in that year. And it was because of that bike's success that motorcycle dealer Ken Haynes then convinced Eric Shenny to create an initial run of 500 John Banks replica bikes to sell commercially, but it's actually said that only 200 were built using the old BSA motors. Then, towards the end of the 1970s, motorcycle engineer and bike builder Rod Spry then went on to build a John Banks replica based around this Honda XR 500 four-stroke motor, and he originally only built around a dozen bikes, although since then Rod has went on to produce many more of these Honda-based JBR 500s. Now, although Rod Spry builds these bikes, the frames are all made by Mark Janik at Mojo Motorbikes. Now, Mark actually used to work for Matisse way back in the day, and he made over 400 chassis for Matisse before he started in business for himself with Mojo Motorbikes. Now, there have been several variations of these JBR Hondas manufactured down through the years, and original JBRs are all fitted with the Mark Janik Mojo Motorcycles built frames. But this bike of Donny's is another good example of these JBR bikes, and they're very popular with riders who use them for twin shock racing, mainly because of that good handling chassis and of course that solid and almost unbreakable Honda 500 motor. Although almost all of Mark Janik's JBR Honda frames are all made exclusively for Rod Spry Engineering, who build these bikes. Now, normally these are all chrome plated, although you can specify your particular JBR in whichever colour that takes your fancy. Okay, next up we are going to take a look at Andy Malloch's original 1980 Montesa 414 Cappra. Now, you know how originality is quite important to many viewers of my YouTube channel, and this featured bike of Andy's is about as authentic as they get. Now, there may be the odd bolt, screw or nut that doesn't have the big M for Montesa stamped on it, but this is still an honest old classic bike that gets blasted around the track almost weekly at various vintage and twin shock race events. But these 414 Montesas were maybe not the most popular bikes internationally, as many of the smaller European bike manufacturers tended to focus on the more local UK and European markets when selling their bikes, and these Spanish Montesas sold in decent numbers in the early 1980s, although it wouldn't be too long before the bigger Japanese bike builders were flooding the market with arguably cheaper and better motocross machines. Now don't get me wrong here, these were still very good bikes with their simple piston port two-stroke motors and that forward folding kickstarter and magnesium engine casings. Now the bike's side panels and of course the fuel tank were all made of plastic, as per many of the other bike manufacturers of that period, and Andy's Montesa here still has its original front and rear mudguards. Conventional drum brakes once again, and although these were getting on a bit now in technology terms, they still did a very good job of slowing down the bike. But there's very few of these old Montesas still on the track these days, and I think you have to have a certain affection towards the brand to keep racing them or even owning one. But Andy's loyalty is without question on his particular 414, and not only does he love riding this bike, it's taken him to many a top podium finish in the past. Now this next bike was another little gem that I spotted at the 2020 Telford Classic Dirt Bike Show, and it's a lovely looking 1976 KX250 Kawasaki. Now this bike was on display and advertised for sale on the day at £4,800. Now I don't think it's a fully original bike, but it certainly looks like it's undergone a restoration at one time or another. But it's still a cracking looking little twin shocker, that's for sure, and as far as I'm aware it wasn't actually sold on the day. Now whether that was because the price was just too steep, or that it maybe just wasn't the kind of bike that buyers were looking for on the day, I don't know, but you'd think that somebody may have snapped it up. But the little bike appeared to have all the right parts fitted on it, and everything looked correct for a 1976 KX, and even if you weren't going to race this bike, it would have still have made a nice bike as a collector's piece. Well, that is of course if you like your Kawasaki's. Now I'm certainly no expert here, although I think these were called the A3s back in the day as I remember, and they were quite good bikes with their simple two-stroke motors that pushed out, I think it was about 34 horsepower. Now I also remember them being quite light at the time, and I think they weighed about 220 pounds mark, so they were quite a flickable little machine. But of course that's the great thing about this Telford Classic Dirt Bike Show, there's something for everybody there, whether you race bikes, buy or sell bikes, or just like looking at vintage motorcycles. There's always something there to interest you, and hopefully this event will still go ahead in 2021 when it's scheduled for this May. But of course this little KX250 is just one of the hundreds of classic dirt bikes that you can feast your eyes on if you visit the show over the course of the 2 days. But don't forget, bring plenty of cash with you, because you'll more than likely pick up a bargain when you're there. Now although this is 2021 and this bike was filmed just over a year ago, who knows, this may not be sold as yet, so maybe if you think that this might be of interest to you, then why not give Mark a call on this number to see if he still has it for sale. But yet again another fine example of one of these long lost classic dirt bikes from back in the day, a very nice 1976 KX-A3 Kawasaki 250. Okay, moving right along, this is Steve Mitton's 1983 510 Husqvarna 4-banger. Now as you can see, Steve doesn't spend his off days polishing and painting his race bike, as this old timer's certainly showing all its wear and tear and racing battle scars for everybody to see. Now, if these big four-strokers are your cup of tea, then you'll love these 510 Husqvarnas. Although, on the other hand, if you're a rider that enjoys a light, flickable two-smoker that's easy to start and throw around, then you most probably wouldn't buy one of these old Huskies. Although these old 510s maybe had a reputation for being a bit hard to start, and they were quite heavy as a race bike, and many riders, including Steve, loved them, most probably because of the endless stream of power that you got from that four-stroke motor. Now, as you know, these engines were a single cylinder but had a twin port cylinder head that had two header pipes that flowed down either side of the bike, connecting to two tailpipes that exited from just underneath the seat. But you were never short of power when you rode one of these old Huskies, and they had a set of decent suspension on the front and the rear. Now, as I remember, the original rear shocks were built by the Swedish Öhlins company for these bikes, although they were then, of course, painted blue and had a Husqvarna logo stamped on them. But if you were ever racing against one of these TC510 Husqvarnas, then this is the view that tells you when you're coming up behind one of these bikes, when you can see these twin tailpipes sticking out the rear. But mind you, despite the bike's size and the handicap weight of that big engine, I've seen a few top riders on one of these bikes, and more recently when Joel Hughes raced one at the Revival Scramble in 2018, and he dominated one of the twin shock classes the entire day riding one of these thumpers, and you can see that very day's racing by just checking out the Revival Scramble 2018 on my YouTube channel. But you really have to love these four strokes to own and race one of these big 510s, and if you have the talent to muscle one around the track, it can be a very competitive package. Okay, just to finish off this latest Paddock Bikes video, we're going to take a look at Callum Whitelaw's quite nice Honda CR250 Red Rocket. Now, I'm not entirely sure of the year of this bike, but it certainly looks like it could be a 1978 or even a 79 machine. Not an original example, of course, but a very nice looking twin shock racer all the same. Now, when these Red Rockets came out in the late 1970s, everybody and even their dog just had to have one, because these Honda two-strokers with their fire engine red motors were just so radically different from anything that had gone before, and riders across the globe just seemed to order one in their thousands. And these 250 reed valve motors were basically tuned down versions of the Honda RC works racers of their day, and not only did this motor look the part, it could rev to the moon and back, although the mid-range was where this motor's sweet spot lay. Now, magnesium was used on the engine casings, and just the full-up weight of the engine alone weighed only 56 pounds. Now, Honda made the claim at the time that this motor put out about 36 horsepower, which was a quite bold statement at the time, when even the bigger 500 two-strokers were struggling to touch the 40 horsepower mark on the dyno, but in reality the power on this bike was much closer to the 30 horsepower mark. Now, as you can see, Callum's Red Rocket has had its exhaust system changed, as you'd expect for a bike that's now approaching 43 years old. Now, the rear shocks again have been swapped for these piggyback YSS units, which will be a big improvement over the softer factory fitted Honda shocks. Now, a steel swing arm for the 1970s with again more of that weight saving magnesium on that brake backplate. Now these front forks on Callum's bike is another reason that the machine's not original, because it's fitted with these American made Steve Simons front forks. Now Simons was hugely instrumental in improving the front end travel on these kind of motocrosser machines back in the 1970s and 80s, and he was said to be the man who revolutionised the introduction of the upside down fork in the 1980s. Now again, Callum's fitted this alloy exhaust guard to his rocket, probably to protect that quite expensive looking new pipe from any damage. But again, these YSS piggyback shocks are very good quality and of course made here in the UK, and these suspension units are very popular with riders doing motocross or enduro riding. But once again, another old classic and a bike that's still hugely popular today, more than 40 years since it was launched. And if you're looking for an old vintage racer, then you can't go wrong with a 250 Red Rocket. Well, I hope you enjoyed that latest batch of vintage racers from back in the day from my archives. And in my next video posting, we are going classic racing once again, and we'll be taking a look at the racing action from the Scottish Classic Motorcycle Racing Club's event that was held at Lockerbie in 2017. So I hope you'll return to take a look at that. So once again, thanks for your continuing support of my channel, and we'll all speak again very soon when we return to Classic Dirt Bike TV.